Hey, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for attending this afternoon. I know a lot of people have had a long day, and this is right at the end of it before you get to go home. We have a good mix of people registered. I think we have about 40, and I'm sure people will be coming on as we keep going. So we're going to do introductions a few slides in. I am Jessica Booth. I'm the Fine Arts Program Manager here at the Georgia Department of Education. And sorry, get this to go. And we have a few digital meeting norms, just like you have for your students. If you are teaching virtually right now, like so many people are, try to be focused and present. We know it's difficult to pay attention for the whole 35 minutes. We do have some question and answer periods mixed in and a question and answer session at the very end. Also, if you look on your GoToWebinar control panel, you will see a little arrow with questions. That's for you to be able to ask questions. My colleagues, Paul and Casey, are manning the question booth kind of and making sure that I see whatever you ask. Also make sure that your video is muted. We are muting it from our end, but when it's time for discussions, we will unmute you so that you have control over it to mute, to be able to unmute yourself, to be able to talk and ask questions or to participate in the discussion. So just kind of know, I'll give you a 3, 2, 1 countdown when I'm unmuting you. Be willing to share and participate. This is what makes it a good session. It gives you some ideas, and have an open mind. If you have any questions, make sure you put it in that question box. This is a presentation that I've done, I think 4, 5, 6 times now. I know twice nationally about how ESSA and federal funding can be used for arts education. We're really lucky in that at the Department of Education, the superintendent has been an amazing art supporter, and we are now the only fine arts team of 3 in the entire country. I am joined today by Casey Hall, our fine arts program specialist. Casey has a music background. He's actually, his role or his position is paid for through one of the title programs. And Paul McLean, who is another fine arts program specialist. His background is theater and film. And my background is visual and media arts. So we always go through the beginning of our sessions and kind of talk about some of the things that the DOE is doing for arts education in the state. And as we go through this presentation, which is a little different than most of our other ones, most of what you see on the screen in front of you is actually paid for through Title 4A or Title II, in our case, at the state level. So right now, besides being the biggest fine arts department, just by one, several have 2 people. We also were the creators of the STEAM certification that K-12 schools can get across the state. We now have 4 full-time staff members that work with STEM and STEAM and do a fantastic job and run that program. We also are the creators of the Fine Arts Diploma Seal. We've had more than 5,000 students across the state graduate with a Fine Arts Diploma Seal now. We also are the keepers of the Georgia Standards of Excellence, which were created for more than 460 courses. We're also the people who write the state course descriptions and really keep up everything you think of as far as fine arts for the state, the website, the resources. We're really proud. We've had some big milestones. Dramatic writing is a theater course that now counts as the first dual credit course for fine arts. It counts as a 4th English, and the students receive a theater credit towards a pathway and probably towards the diploma seal as well. And we've created more than 3,000 instructional resources for teachers now, including a whole new series of digital lesson plan examples that we are housing to kind of help teachers along in this journey of virtual learning. We also work with our federal programs to choose and distribute. It's been it's been more than $500,000 now, and we're in the grant process right now for the START grants, which are small $10,000 grants to increase access to arts education in rural areas. We also create statewide professional development courses like this one, run a district arts coordinators council across the state, helped create the new CCRPI points guidelines for arts education that students have access. And we've created a series of self-paced learning opportunities for teachers through our professional learning opportunity module on the web, but also we have some that are connected to our fine arts website that I'll show you in just a second. So I'm gonna go forward a little bit. This is kind of an example of what those instructional resources look like. This is, if you're a brand new teacher or you've been teaching a long time, but you're teaching a class for the first time, like say you're a band director and your school decides to offer an orchestra class. These resources have been vital for our teachers the last few years. They include unit plans, example lesson plans. There are assessment examples. There's shows ways to do differentiation. They all include the assessments and vocabulary lists. We're really proud of them, and people have been really, really excited about them. So this is our session agenda for today. The idea of the big question, what No Child Left Behind and life as a non-core subject was like for most of the folks in our state, the impact of ESSA on arts education across the country, show me the money, which is what everybody always wants to know, some examples from the field that we've done here at the DOE and that some of our school districts have done, and the long game, how to help fund the arts and how to provide supports for the arts. And then we'll do a question and answer section at the end. So the big question for me that I get at least once a day, and when I'm at a conference, it's all anyone wants to talk to me about, is how do you fund arts education? How do you fund a band program if you only have chorus or you don't have any instruments? How do you fund a teacher in a rural area where the principal can't afford to have a teacher? How do you get money for a special project you want to do? Or how do you get money for computers so you can teach media arts? And it kind of goes on and on and on. And funding's been a really big issue for the arts. It wasn't always, but with the federal education funding policy, No Child Left Behind, the arts were considered a non-core subject. And the reason why I have a whiteboard on as the picture is because it's a good way to lead into a story about my own experience. I started teaching in the mid-90s, and the first few years, there was a lot of support for arts education. There was a lot of funding. I taught in a very large school district. I started as a middle school teacher. And shortly after I started teaching, No Child Left Behind became the law of the land for education in the United States. And it became really apparent, even starting that very first year, that No Child Left Behind had unintended consequences that the writers never meant to do. And one of the big ones is that by saying that federal funding was to be used for core subjects, which were at that point math, English, social studies, and science, it eliminated all of the ways that local school districts were funding arts education. And the whiteboard was the first time I really noticed it. And as a teacher, you're not always aware of what's going on behind the scenes or why things happen. So everyone in my middle school got a whiteboard except me, the other art teacher, the two music teachers, and the PE department. And we couldn't figure out why. I felt like the cafeteria was going to get a whiteboard before the specials rooms. And it turned out that the school was using federal Title I funds to purchase those whiteboards, those interactive boards, which were brand new, super exciting at the time, revolutionizing education in the classroom. So as a teacher, we just thought, hey, nobody really, I guess, thinks we're really teaching, and we didn't get one. But really, it's because of this federal funding and a law that was put into place. We didn't know that it wasn't that our administrators didn't support us, and that it wasn't that our school system wasn't supporting us, or that the state wasn't supporting us. It was that the way that it was written, that federal funding could not be used in our classrooms at the state level. And it changed almost everything. So, that very next year, I wanted to go and present for the very first time at an art convention in the state, so the Georgia Art Education Association convention. And my proposal was accepted, and I was a brand new teacher, and I was super excited, and my principal said, I'm really sorry, but I don't have any funding because I can't use the money that I usually use for substitutes for your class. And that was another example of where this federal law, because we were outside of it, it cut off a lot of places that principals and school systems used to use to fund the arts. So through all the time, we saw a reduction of arts teachers across the country. It's not a Georgia problem, it was an everywhere problem. And we saw a real de-emphasis on the arts, and really only an emphasis on those core subjects for several years. And when I came to the Department of Education, I had been a fine arts director at a school district for 7 years at that point. And this was kind of the outlook for the arts in Georgia under No Child Left Behind in 2015. I was the first fine arts specialist or anything at the DOE in more than 23 years. We had no arts access requirements for kindergarten through 12th grade. If a school district said, hey, we don't want to have the arts, there was no way for us to say, that's really not the best thing for kids. We didn't have standards for 45% of our courses in fine arts, but we do have over 460 courses, which is more than all of career technical agriculture education put together and larger than any other subject area. But of the remaining courses that did have standards, that 55%, some of them were from 1993, some of them were from before then, and some of them were Georgia standards or Georgia performance standards from the 2000s. We didn't have any rural arts opportunities for teachers or supports. No one was going to Coastal Plains, RESA, and doing trainings. No one was going outside of the metro area and helping them. And honestly, no one was in the metro area helping anyone either. We didn't have any instructional resources like that unit plan or lesson plan I just showed you for teachers. There really was nowhere to go. There was no training opportunities from the state like this one or the hands-on workshops that I've done in the past. We didn't have any recognition for students at the state level in the arts, like the Fine Arts Diploma Seal. There was no arts website, no arts presence, and really, for the most part, there were no arts outside of the metro areas. And even then, it was getting smaller and smaller. So I lucked out. I came to the DOE, and I had really good timing. A lot of people would say it was a lot of dumb luck, but I ended up with this trifecta of support I wasn't ever planning on getting. I became an administrator in 2009, which for those of you that were teaching at that time know that that was kind of when the bottom fell out of the economy with the recession. And the arts were cut because there was no way to fund us, and it was the easiest thing to cut and not be penalized under the other guidelines. So my entire career as an administrator was kind of like, hey, I'm really sorry, we have less money this year, but we're going to do this instead. And then the next year I said, yeah, we have less money again, and I'm only going to be able to provide this many professional developments. So when I came to the DOE, I was a little bit in shock of how lucky we really were. We had three things going for us, and one is that the arts were making a lot of money for the state of Georgia for the first time ever. It was becoming the new cash crop of the state, and it still is doing really, really well, even in this environment. The creative industries in the state have more than 200,000 Georgians employed, but we were having an issue with all of these companies calling us and saying, hey, we have all these positions, but high school students in Georgia don't take arts. So we don't have anyone to fill them. So that created a lot of opportunities. So we were making a little bit of money, which helped politicians and people who may not have been huge art supporters see that the arts could be an economic factor for the state. Then we really, really were lucky in that the only reason why my position exists is because Superintendent Woods is such a huge art supporter. And when he came to the DOE as superintendent, even in that first month, he looked around and said, wait, we have a curriculum instruction person for everything. We have multiples in almost every subject. Why is there no one over fine arts? His dedication to the arts has been outstanding. He's been recognized nationally for distinguished service outside the field of arts education. And our state strategic plan for schools, the very first sentence on the first page talks about that we would like students to be ready to learn, live, and lead. And in that first sentence, it says that we want students to have fine arts opportunities, regardless of whether they live in rural Georgia or metropolitan Georgia. And then the third part of that trifecta of good luck and good timing was the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is called ESSA, and it replaced No Child Left Behind. And the biggest part of ESSA was that the government realized that they inadvertently killed a lot of things that students love to go to school for, like the arts, because of the funding streams. It wasn't intentional, it's just how things were funded when we ended up in a recession as a country and people had to reduce and reduce and reduce. You know, we had a lot of schools where students had a PE opportunity because it was federally mandated, but not a lot else. Like when they would have gone to art and music or dance and theater, they were going to remediation classes for math or ELA because, yes, they needed remediation, but also because they already had teachers in the building, and it didn't cost anything extra to have supplies or to have somebody in that room. So the best thing about the Every Student Succeed Act is it did move the arts back into the world of core academic subject. So this is the section from ESSA where it says that every student in the United States deserves a well-rounded education. And it ended up becoming a civil rights issue, like an equity issue, because the students who have the least opportunities, students who are on free and reduced lunch, our poorest students, whether those are urban or rural, they were the least likely to get opportunities like STEM, STEAM, the arts, or music. The arts and music are separated in the bill, which is a little strange, but the arts is not visual art. It's all arts except music, because if you think about it, it's theater arts, dance, it's performing arts, it's visual and media arts, and then music is a separate category. So by saying that every student in the United States deserves a well-rounded education, it's saying that every student in the United States deserves to have access to an arts programming. And that it's really not fair that students who tended to be in wealthier areas had more options. The bill also, whoops, sorry, I went backwards. The bill also gave specific funding for arts integration. And we think of arts integration mostly of STEAM, which is the certification program that we have. We now have a new arts integration award for schools that are doing arts integration into all subjects outside of STEM, like they're doing STEM subjects and they're integrating the arts into social studies and ELA and health and physical education. But there's specific money that that is given out, and they kind of made a little clause that says, hey, this is okay. We want to make sure you know that you can combine arts and mathematics. You can combine the arts and science, and we will help fund that. So I guess my question to the group, and you'll have to use your little question section that you put your names in earlier, is how is the arts funded now in Georgia, in your school district? Most school districts are funded by a combination of federal and state funding. And a lot of the state funding comes from federal funding. So this is a CliffsNote version of the non-technical definitions of kind of these title buckets. And depending on where your school is or what your school is like, you may or may not have heard of one or more of these. Title I funding is the largest funding source. So it is usually students who are on free and reduced lunch. There's a large percentage of your school that has that, or your school system. And the goal is to ensure that low-income students succeed academically. Title II is teacher quality. So most of the time, if you're a teacher and you had any kind of staff development, the staff development was paid for, whether that was the sub for you to leave the building, or it was the speaker, if you had a good speaker who came in at your system hired, or even the registration for you to go to a conference came from Title II, which is all about teacher quality. Title III is English language acquisition. So if you are in a school that has a really high ELL population, Title III is usually funding a lot of things at the school for both the students and their families to help them learn English. And then Title IV is access to a well-rounded education. And I just showed you on the last slide, like ESSA says, every student deserves a well-rounded education. So that's kind of a quick Cliff Notes version of federal funding, just so you can keep it in your brain and get the larger picture. So what ways can that kind of funding fund arts education? And all of these are done at the school district level. So, you know, we're gonna at the end of this go through like what would your next steps be, because, you know, going into your principal and saying, hey, ESSA says I should have money is not going to work, because it's a long game and you really have to plan it out. It's not something that happens overnight. But these are all ways that you can use ESSA funding to fund arts education. So with Title I, you could use arts integration as a model to increase learning in other subjects, specifically ELA and math. So we have a lot of schools. Powder Springs Elementary School in Cobb County is one of them. That's a great example. K-Pace Academy in Clayton County is another great example. where these are schools that have used arts integration to increase achievement in other subjects by integrating the arts into those subjects and done very, very well in test scores. So what they're doing is they're utilizing parts of that Title I funding for training for teachers in arts integration, for the supplies and the instruments they need. Title II funding can provide subject-specific training to arts teachers. And when I say arts, I'm talking about dance, theater, music, visual and media arts. The idea is that I know for many years under No Child Left Behind as a teacher, I never had any training in my actual subject area unless it was my district level coordinator in the central office. So during pre-planning, our art coordinator would create professional development opportunities for us. And sometimes we might have one throughout the school year, but all of the professional development I received in my building was always for someone else's subject. I even sat through whiteboard training that I didn't get more than once. So Title II funds and ESSA are to be used for subject-specific training. So if you were in a position where you didn't have an opportunity to go to like the music conference because your school couldn't pay for it, now they could pay for your registration, because then you can show on your teacher keys or TEKS that you've had subject-specific training. Title III can be used to provide arts resources as long as they are helping increase language acquisition in the ELL student population. So you could buy art supplies if it is for a training that you're going to have for parents to increase language acquisition, or for students if they're using arts integration to learn that language. And then Title IV, which I'm going to dive into probably the most, specifically lists funding music and the arts as a potential area that those funds could help districts and schools increase access. And I think the biggest thing for people who are not administrators to realize, and as a teacher, I never knew any of these things, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me why things happened. But really, the why is so important to getting to the advocacy and the funding and all of the respect that you would like your programs to get. So these funds have to be just to supplement what's already happening in the school. It can't supplant. And supplant means, say your principal was using this funding to hire, have someone come in and do training. They can't substitute what they were using, the money they were using to get that training, with one of these other monies. It can't take the place of, it's in addition to. So it's the same thing for equipment. Like if you were paying through equipment through your local school district, you can't have then taking that money away to put somewhere else and then using these funds. So Title IV-A really helps with funding well-rounded education. And it funds educational technology, safe and healthy students, and then the idea of a well-rounded education. The first two on this list, 1 and 2, have to be spent on evidence-based programs. So the well-rounded section is really where the arts fall under, and that's really what we need to pay attention to. Although the arts also can help with positive behavior intervention systems, they can help with social emotional learning, which would be number 2. The arts also need some educational technology, so there may be some funding opportunities there that are smaller, but really well-rounded education is where we're seeing most school districts across the state allocate funds. There are super complicated state guidelines about those, and it's not something that you as a teacher would ever dive into. But it's important to know where the money comes from so that you know how to ask for it and to give suggestions on like, hey, I'd really like to do this. Do you think in next year's plan we could add this in? So annually, the federal government provides states with funding, and in Georgia, we pass that funding straight on to you. And those allocations are spent at the district level, not at the school site level typically. So the school district, say you're in Cobb County Schools, they will get the funding and they will decide how it's distributed out to schools. So it's not necessarily that your principal is not giving you money, it's usually that there's some issue in the pipeline that the funding is not happening. So this is kind of a good diagram to show you If your school district receives more than $30,000 in Title IV funding, which most do, but some of our smaller districts do not, it's all based on the formulas for Title I funding, which is the amount of students who are on a free and reduced lunch for your district. So it's a similar ratio. So 20% of that money, no less than 20%, must be spent on a well-rounded education. So even if your school district was like, or in your mind was like, I hate the arts, I don't want to do anything, they must spend at least 20% on a well-rounded education. 20% must be spent on safe and healthy schools. A lot of that is when school districts put in counselors a few years ago, and everyone's like, wow, this is so great. How do we finally get counselors? How do we finally get folks for mental health? A lot of times it was funding from ESSA, you just didn't know. And then no more than 60% of the well-rounded funding from Title IV-A can be spent on technology. So, you know, don't worry that your school district's just going to buy a whole new refresh of computers for every computer lab in the school, and then the students still aren't going to have art, music, dance, or theater. If your district is below $30,000 that they receive, which is usually districts that have fairly wealthy students, but also some very tiny school districts, they have to spend money on activities in at least one of the 3 categories. So it's a little bit different, but most districts in Georgia receive greater than 30,000. So I wanted to go through some examples from the field. And sorry, my computer froze for a second there. Some examples from the field of the ways we've seen funding be used towards arts education. Staff positions. Here at the DOE, we have 2 content specialists for music and theater because we needed to increase training opportunities. Those were paid for through title funding. We've seen school districts through the START grants who did not have any arts at all in their elementary school pay for a part-time teacher with some of those funds, and even pay for a full-time teacher and use some of those funds to do a portion of their salary. We've seen lots of arts integration professional development. That can be funded depending on how your school system's plan is through Title I, II, or 4A. We've seen subject-specific PD for fine arts teachers for the first time in a long time. Anecdotally, the 4 state arts organizations have had better attendance since ESSA at every single conference, because for the very first time, the teachers are not paying for the registration out of pocket. It doesn't mean that they're going to put you up in the Hyatt and pay for everything the whole time, but it does mean that you are getting access to arts, true arts training in some cases for the first time, and not just training in, here's an ELA training adapted to your classroom, and how could you teach ELA in your music room? Or how could you teach mathematics in your dance classroom? Instructional resources for the arts. Here at the DOE, we've created those 3,000 plus unit plans, scope and sequence, lesson plans, videos, assessments. All of those were paid for with Title IV-A funds over the years. We've just kept building and building it. It is the one thing that we hear the most from the field that has made a huge difference, besides our START grant, which is fabulous. Instruments. People always say, well, you know, my students can't afford instruments and my school district doesn't really have any money. This is something that your school district could write into the plan. Is if your school district did not already provide instruments for students, they might be able to work into the plan that they could fund some instruments for students who have economic hardship. And then we have other school districts that provide everyone with instruments. So you couldn't use this money to replace the money you're already using for that, but if it's something new, you can use it. And then equipment and art supplies for visual art, we've seen through our START grant and through some of the other funding opportunities that have opened up, schools get kilns for the first time in order to be able to do the ceramics, Georgia Standards of Excellence for K through 12. We've seen them buy everything from paper cutters to consumable supplies. A lot of school districts have a SPLOST, or they have funding that comes from an equipment budget. And it's a real problem for visual arts that the other arts areas do not have as big an issue with. And that is that most of the time in visual arts, everything's gone at the end of the year. Like, you spent $500 on paper and paint and pencils, but it was used. where if you spent $500 on a flute, it usually will survive multiple school years, or you spend $500 on some lighting for your auditorium for theater and dance. So the Title IV-A money could be used at the school district level to purchase materials for a classroom, even if they're consumables, as long as it increases access for students and it wasn't already being paid for that way. Technology, we've seen school systems, we've seen schools buy laptop carts so that a high school could offer media arts and offer graphic design for the first time through some of the grants. We've seen iPads purchased to be able to do some music technology on it at elementary school. And then one of the other things that we have been able to do at the DOE level with Title IV funds is if students wanted to, if teachers wanted to be advanced placement certified or get IB certified, and there's a new one called Cambridge International Examinations, if they wanted to be trained so that it increases the access for the students at their school, they could use some of their grant money for that. That opens it up where more and more students can have those advanced classes. So those are some examples, a lot of them at the DOE. Here's the other one I briefly talked about, and that is that we started the START grants. We're in our 3rd year. So for, oops, that's supposed to say Title IV. Whoops, it says 5. But with the START grants, the goal of the START grants is to increase access, especially for our rural areas that had really lost almost all arts education at the elementary level. And we've seen amazing things firsthand being done in these schools. And the START grant is open right now for this year. There are $10,000 grants to districts that are considered REAP districts, which are rural districts that are designated by the federal government. There's a list of them on the Title IV-A website that's run by my colleague Don Hatcher. So if you're like, ooh, my school might qualify, you're going to want to go to Godot.org and look up the Title IV-A page, and you'll be able to see a list of all those schools. But the idea is that every year we're trying to give away $250,000 to start new programming in the arts and to increase access for students that didn't have it in the past. Also through the DOE, another example is something that everybody in Georgia can use, whether you're a rural school or not, is that our high school that is virtual, which is Georgia Virtual School, or GAVS, has several, as you can see on screen, virtual classes that high school students can take. So say you are in a high school that does not offer dramatic writing, or brand new theater class that counts as a theater credit towards a pathway or diploma seal, and it counts as a 4th English. You can take a Georgia Virtual School class, if you're a high school student, in dramatic writing for free if your school doesn't offer it. We have lots of students in rural schools that maybe only have music, like they only have a band, they don't have chorus, they don't have an advanced music class like music theory, and so you're a kid who wants to take art. Well, you can take enough art classes now on Georgia Virtual School that you can receive not just a pathway in the arts, but you can also get a diploma seal. So this is one of the ways that this federal funding through ESSA is benefiting the whole state through the DOE. We also have a platform called the PLO, or the Professional Learning Opportunities page. It used to be called Georgia Learns. I need to change the logo out. But this is a platform that you as a teacher can access through SLDS. Wherever you put your grades in, you will find the PLO. It's where you can take online courses. And if you were an arts teacher until really recently, there was nothing in there for you. Kind of like the instructional resources in the Teacher Resource Link, or TRL. But now we have 3 courses that are live right now. We've had really good feedback from the folks that have taken the classes. We have two classes that are for elementary school art and music. They were paid for through Title IV-A funds at the state level. Their goal is to aid new teachers on how to teach elementary art and music, and general education teachers who are teaching elementary art and music to their homeroom classroom. We also have one brand new theater course called Dramatic Writing. It's that same class, that's the ELA and theater credit. And it is a very in-depth course to get teachers prepared to teach that class, because that class is taught by people who are ELA certified and teachers who are theater certified. They seldomly are both. So if you're a theater teacher, you need more in-depth a more in-depth guide to the ELA portion. And if you're an ELA teacher, you tend to need more remediation into the theater and film portion. So what's this long game? Like I said earlier, it's like, yes, there is lots of federal funding for the arts, but as a classroom teacher, if you come to your principal with your hand out, it usually will not work. And I usually start at the beginning and say, hey, are you on your school's leadership team? And most people who ask me about money, and I ask that too, say, no, I would never do that. And I have to say, you have to start locally and be proactive. So arts advocacy is your #1 way to get funded, whether that is through starting a principal approved social media account that really promotes your program. And if you didn't see the webinar we did Tuesday on social media as a form of arts advocacy, that would be a great place to start. But you really need to do as much as you can do at the local level to be invaluable. Not a lot of teachers volunteer for their school's leadership team. When I volunteered when I was teaching high school, my peers in the art department, there were 4 art teachers, were like, why on earth would you want to stay after school 2 Wednesdays a month for hours on end? And I just thought about it, and I was like, you know, I can't change the perception of the arts and have people understand how important it is to students and how much money it actually needs to be done well if I'm not part of that conversation. So that was my first toe into leadership, was getting on my school's leadership team. Through that process, the school's leadership team is who makes the strategic plan for your school. So if you're in the room when that is made, like our school's mission statement was to prepare students to lead in the arts, academics, and athletics. And it was actually written in that order. That wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been on that leadership team and said, hey, this is really important. This is, you know, this is going to be our mission statement. Once you're on a school leadership team, it gives you an opportunity to say, hey, this is what the principal is interested in. These are the things that our parents and our stakeholders and our community members who are on this team are saying are important for their students. How can the arts help that be successful? And we almost always can. Also, you're going to need to volunteer for lots of committees anywhere you can do it, whether that's your state organization like Georgia Art Education Association or the Educational Theaters Association of Georgia or the Georgia Music Education Association. What committees can you get on so that you can see how other people are being successful at getting funding? You will learn more than you ever thought you could learn in just a few hours of your time on a state or national committee. And then remember that when you decide you're going to make a plan and you're saying, hey, I'd like to see how I can get art supplies for my classroom, like the one teacher said she needed earlier, you have to be polite. People don't like it when there's a handout and a demand. But you need to be able to back it up with the knowledge of, hey, I would really like to do this project with our English language learners because, say, you're in a school that has a high ELL population. I know that I can do this activity that I learned about in research that will help them increase their language acquisition skills. And in order to do this, it's going to cost $125. That is more likely to be funded by your principal because you backed it up and said, hey, this is for our ELL learners. I don't know if there's any Title III funding that's available for this year, but maybe we could plan for it for next year, but this is how much money I need. And if your school district has a fine arts coordinator, or many of the bigger districts have an art and a music, like a visual and media arts and a performing arts coordinator, they have multiple. They're really the people who are at the table for you in the same way you're at the table for your program at your school level for the whole school district. So usually they're the first place to start. They usually have access to funds that you would never have as a teacher. And usually they're the people who are trying to organize behind the scenes how you could advocate for your programs. So that's kind of the long game. Like, I want you to understand the background of the funding. It's not that your administrators are not, that they're not supportive. It's not that they hate the arts. It's that there's a very limited amount of funding, even with ESSA, and they have priorities. So you want to become part of that priority by saying, hey, if our priority is raising ELA scores as a school, and I know this from looking at the strategic plan of the school, I want to do this in my music class to raise those scores, or I want to do this to increase community engagement because that is on our school's CCRPI report card. That sort of makes sense. I know that it's a big like overview, like a bird's eye perspective of something that's really complicated that I've tried to break down as small as possible. But knowing what I just explained in the Cliff Notes version, you're much better prepared to make a request in the future. And just know that budgets are built way in advance. Like right now, the money is probably allocated for most of the year. If you wait until the end of the year and ask for something, sometimes you're lucky and your principal has money left over because something fell through, or they had a little slush fund just in case something happened and it didn't happen. And I know at the end of the year, I was always very successful in getting some of that funding for the following year. But now is the time to start advocating for your programs and becoming a leader in your school so that the people who are making those decisions really understand the power of arts education and what it means to students and where you fit in that picture. Because now is the time, like before winter break is usually when budgets are starting to be submitted to central offices in order to get funding for the following school year. So it really is a long game. So this is a summary of what we talked about today, and I know it's a lot and your heads are probably swimming and you probably have a lot of questions, is the Every Student Succeed Act did make the arts, and arts includes visual media, dance, and theater and film, core subjects. Federal funding has been used since ESSA to improve arts education across Georgia. We have made enormous strides. Almost everything I showed you that's happened since 2015 was paid for through title funding in Title 4A. We've had a great partnership with that department. Title funding, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, there is a 5, has specific earmarks, and each school district makes those decisions, not the DOE. They decide where that money is going to be used and how it's going to help students the best. And principals are a part of that voice. So you definitely want to make sure that you start locally with your school leader, and your school leader or your arts coordinator, if you have one, and they're the people who will represent you at the table at the district level. The DOE, even if you don't get $1 out of your local school district, provides so many free resources now through title funding and through the abilities that we've had to produce these things through ESSA. So know that even if you feel disheartened and something doesn't work out exactly the way you wanted it, there are lots of free opportunities through ESSA, through title funding from our department. So if you look at our website, which I'll pull up towards the end, you will see all of the classes to sign up for. You'll see the lesson plan links to the digital sample lesson plans, all of our unit and lesson plans and the instructional resources. We even created a smart infographic where you download this PDF, and as you click the items on the PDF, short 5 to 10 minute videos pop up and show you digital best practices, but tailored specifically to dance, theater, music, and visual media arts. So there's lots and lots of training at the school level and district level happening about best practices in digital teaching and learning, but they almost never drill it down to our subject areas, and this actually does. So please create a plan and know that if you want to be involved, that you need to be involved in order to make this work, in order to get the funding. The more I was involved at my local school level and at the state and national level through my education organizations, the more successful I was getting funding for my program, getting support for my program. Tuesday, I had a presentation on social media. The social media and getting the word out about the work we've done at the DOE has probably been the single most impactful thing that I did the first 3 years I was in this position. Paul now does our social media and does a way better job than I did. So I expect better things to come. But these are the highlights. This is kind of a highlight reel to give you an idea of how to start planning. So in the handout section on the GoToWebinar control panel on the right, we have some links to these websites. So Georgia DOE has the Whole Child website, which is kind of the Georgia version of Well-Rounded. We came up with our own name. Some articles from the Association of Supervision, the Arts Education Partnership. NAFME is the National Association for Music Education, and Grant Makers in the Arts. They are all talking about how schools, school districts, and states have used the arts, and we're really, really fortunate in that some of the things we did earlier than other states. And Georgia is highlighted over and over again in this documents as states to watch, as states who were successful in utilizing the funds that they had in unique ways in order to promote arts education. This goes to somebody at the DOE who's way more important to me than me. I think policy. And eventually we get some feedback from you on whether or not you found this useful. So if you do QR codes and you're super fancy, you can use the QR code on the right. It's a 4-question survey. And if you don't use QR codes, you would just put in the Google, or googly people say, web address, and then it'll give you the same exact question and answer little survey of 4 questions. But thank you so much for coming today. It's a big topic. It's probably, I mean, it is the thing I'm asked about the most, and it's really complicated. So at a teacher level, the best thing you can do is get involved at the school level to match what you're doing in the classroom to the strategic plan. And even here at the DOE, I sit down with, in the past, Paul, and now with Casey, and we look at the state strategic plan that is created by the superintendent. And then our goals for the year that we come up with are always based on how can we, which parts of the strategic plan can we make a difference in and can we add to. So thank you for your time.
For questions, please contact the Fine Arts team. Jessica Booth, Paul McLean, Casey Hall.